On the earth there were many plants and animals, but the gods had no one to worship them, as none of the creatures could speak. So, the gods created people from mud, but these people had no souls, and thus were killed in a great flood. The gods tried again, this time with wood, but these people could not talk or worship, and so most were destroyed. Those that weren't killed fled to the trees and became monkeys. The third time, the gods used corn as the building blocks of humans, and this time, the gods were successful in creating humans that could worship and speak. The gods loved this, and so began the era of man. As with most places in the Americas, the people that would come to reside in Belize were nomadic people that followed the herds of animals that they hunted. However, dramatic shifts in the weather led to the extinction of many traditional targets of these native people. This tanked the population of Belize, and people were forced to search for new food sources, which led to the domestication of certain plants such as corn and squash. This gradually began the sedentary lifestyle of the native people of the region. Due to this lifestyle, we see the Mayan civilization arise, with their permanent settlements throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. These settlements became increasingly complex, with professional stoneworks, pyramid structures, and city building. The Mayans began trading the precious goods found in the region, like jade and obsidian, to other native people in Mesoamerica, primarily the Olmec civilization. This trade helped increase local wealth, and influenced many buildings, as we see Olmec styles in some masonry. The city of Cerros rose to prominence as a trading hub for the inland Mayan cities, the most important of which being El Mirador. Cerros held this position of prominence for some time, but El Mirador was eventually abandoned, directly leading to the decline of Cerros that had dominated the Belizean coast. We now enter a period where city-states arise. These states didn't directly control their subjects, but a system of power and alliances was used to keep other cities in line and working to the benefit of the head of this alliance. One city-state centered around Tikal dominated much of Belize for a time, but this hegemony would soon be rivaled by the Calakmul, who used their power to influence Tikal possessions to change allegiances. In Belize, the primary city that allied with Calakmul was Caracol, which was formerly a Tikal ally. This shifting of alliance was overwhelmingly important, as it gave Calakmul a significant advantage over their enemy, primarily in soldiers. The imbalance of power led to a war between the factions that Calakmul won. Caracol saw a major increase in prosperity and population from this victory, but Caracol wasn't entirely in control of the region, as they had to contend with the Naranjo to the northwest. The perfect occasion came to decide who would rule the region, as Naranjo rebelled against Calakmul. Caracol declared a series of wars in the name of Calakmul, and was able to defeat Naranjo, securing Caracol hegemony over the region, as Naranjo recovered from its defeat. Once Naranjo was done licking its wounds, they attacked Caracol, defeating the city in retribution, and the loss of this war led to the somewhat stagnation of Caracol's prosperity, which had been previously on the rise. Many city-states in the southern Mayan lowlands now mysteriously are abandoned by their citizens. Caracol and other Belizean cities are no exception to this trend, with evidence showing a gradual abandonment. Lamanai is an important exception to this post-classic abandonment, as it benefited from the lack of competition and war in the region. Lamanai continued on, and profited from trade with northern Mayan lowlands cities, which too had avoided the collapse. During this time, Belize was sparsely populated, but more notably, those who continued to live in the region showed a general rejection of traditional Mayan values, with little evidence of kings and the exorbitant luxuries that were prominent in classical Mayan society. Spain began their presence in the New World now, but the Mayans of the Yucatan were able to resist Spanish colonialism, and stayed independent as the Aztecs to the northwest fell. Due to repeated Spanish incursions, and the prospect that what happened to the Aztec would happen to them, the Maya were very hostile to the Spanish. But this rejection of Europeans didn't stop the spread of European disease through the Mayans. It greatly helped in the resistance of the Spanish that the Yucatan Mayans held no centralized allegiance, and so, if one city fell, the Mayans wouldn't collapse entirely. On the other hand, there was no united Mayan army, and the Mayans were human, so rivalries between the Mayan states allowed for the Spanish to stick their fingers in local politics to gain a better foothold in the region. Eventually, the Spanish began their conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula, that wrapped along the northern coast. This meant Mayans fled to Belize en masse, trying to escape the Spanish cruelty. In spite of city after city falling to the Spanish, Mayans in Belize refused to stop fighting, and even set aside past rivalries to unite as one to defend against Spain. But this effort was useless, as the Spanish, allied with other native peoples, defeated the rebellious Mayans and finally subjugated the lands of Belize. Mayans fled to the Petén Basin in modern-day Guatemala, and to Tipu, the last part of modern-day Belize independent from Spain. The lands of Belize were incorporated into the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and was settled very loosely by the Spanish. Very few Spanish settlements were erected, which helped pirates in the Caribbean, who found refuge in the ill-governed lands. The English also used the coast to house their buccaneers, who would raid Spanish ships for their logwood. At the time, logwood was extremely important in the dyeing industry, as it created an easy-to-make, cheap dye. Soon, the last independent part of Belize in Tipu was conquered by the Spanish. The Mayans held out in these lands for some time as an autonomous region, and this annexation signaled a new era for the Mayans in Belize. Slowly now, the British buccaneers on the Belizean coast began harvesting their own logwood and other lumbers, which prompted other English loggers to join them. The English settlers were not liked by the Spanish, but nothing was done to remove them at the time. These loggers brought with them a large number of slaves to primarily work in mahogany and logwood camps, but were used in all fields of manual labor. Spanish hegemony over the Americas at the time scared other European powers a lot, and they would do anything to undermine the Spanish colonial power. The loggers in Belize were the perfect leverage for England to do so. Eventually, there was a treaty between the powers, where Spain allowed for the English to formally take control of islands with British settlements. But the terms for Belize were very unclear, with the English saying their settlers were grounds to annex the land, while Spain claimed that the loggers had no rights to work there. Because of this, several times the Spanish killed or expelled many loggers. But this didn't stop the operations, as their numbers were even growing. The loggers eventually were allowed to legally continue their operations after the Treaty of Paris of 1763 and of 1783, where the Spanish conceded their efforts to rid the land of the English. This, however, came at the expense of other English settlements on the coast of Nicaragua, called the Mosquito Shore. These settlers were relocated to Belize, massively swelling the population. But still, the lands were technically Spanish and not part of the British Empire, despite the region's overwhelming English population. During the French Revolutionary Wars, it was obvious the Spanish were going to try to attack Belize, so the British didn't have a foothold on the mainland to attack Spanish colonies. The colonists knew this, and rather than flee to nearby Caribbean islands, they entrenched and prepared for the attack. The settlers were very desperate for manpower, to the point that they even armed their slaves to aid in the defense. The ensuing Battle of St. George's Caye lasted several days, and the Belizeans were able to repel the Spanish invasion. Unknown to the English, or settlers, this would be the last time the Spanish would try to attack and expel the loggers. Now Belize slowly formed its own government of oligarchs that had control over most land, slaves, and trade. This government, while not officially being part of the British Empire, followed the rule of Britain. It really helped that the lands around Belize gained sovereignty from Spain, meaning the lands had no direct ways for the Spanish to impose their rule. With the primary industry, logging, revolving around slavery, the emancipation of slaves shook the colony quite a fair amount, especially as these newly freed people established their own communities away from their oppressors. The British were nearly forced from their rule in Belize, as they signed a treaty with the USA, stating that neither would colonize Central America. Belize was a gray area, with England having already, in all but name, colonized the lands before the agreement. This caused some contention, but was solved with the agreement that Belize would remain in British hands. And with this formal acceptance of British rule, several treaties were signed, settling Guatemalan and Mexican claims to the land. Belize soon became the colony of British Honduras, under the governor of Jamaica, formally bringing the lands into the British Empire, although the lands were basically a British colony before this, just minus the title. During the Caste Wars of Mexico, many indigenous Mayans fled to British Honduras for protection. But here, the Mayans were not allowed to own land, or were forced to live on reserves. These reserves shrank as time went on, and English settlements pushed deeper and deeper inland. This caused several clashes between the Maya and English, which culminated in the Battle of Orange Walk. Here, nearly 200 Mayans attacked the town of Orange Walk, which had been claimed to be on Mayan land. There were 3 Mayan attack parties. One attacked the town, and the others attacked the barracks from 2 sides. Mayans and the British skirmished back and forth for a while, until the British troops managed to kill the Mayan commander, Marcus Canul. This broke their resolve and sent the Mayans running, and marked the last clash between the Mayans and the British in Belize. Initially, when the First World War erupted, the Belizeans formed a force to aid Britain in their fight, but for one reason or another, these men were rejected from service. And due to the colony not having a method of receiving information on the war reliably, Britain installed the first wireless radio tower in Belize. Eventually, the colony was allowed to send troops to fight in the Great War, once the nature of the war had been evident and the casualties had gotten high enough. But these volunteers were primarily native or black, which meant by the British rules, they were not allowed to fight against Europeans. Belizean soldiers were sent as manual labor on the Western Front, and to fight against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. But, even here, the soldiers faced discrimination and segregation, which did nothing but foster resentment towards the empire that they fought for. Back at home, there was constant fear of Mexico and Guatemala, who were at the moment non-aligned in the war, but had interests in the Central Powers. This was very anxiety-inducing for Belize, as Mexico and Guatemala were bordering them, and that both of these nations had claims on much of Belize's land. The fears were not unjustified, as there was a planned invasion of Belize from Guatemala, as a revolutionary had been in talks with the German Empire. A defense of the colony was mustered, and constantly vigilant until the end of the war. But now, soldiers returned home from the front lines, disgusted with their treatment by the British during the war. Their discontent was also fueled by the economic discrepancies that existed in the colony, that were evidently based on race. And now, the soldiers' pay was being delayed. These men were furious at Britain and took up arms. They were joined by thousands of their comrades, also discontent with the discrimination. Soon armed British soldiers landed in Belize to pacify the population. They were successful in arresting and imprisoning many, and the protests stopped. But the racial injustice remained. The Great Depression hit Belize very hard, and this, paired with one of the worst hurricanes Belize had ever seen hitting the capital city, it was easy to say that the nation was not doing very well. Britain's mismanagement of the situation and refusal for a minimum wage or legalized unions created the beginning of the independence movement in Belize, as many began to strike and demonstrate. Some demands were agreed to, slowly tearing down and changing the oligarchy and colonial administration that ruled Belize with an iron fist. As the Second World War began, the Belizeans took a less combatant role. While some fought with the British, most acted as laborers in Scotland, America, and on the Panama Canal, due to a lack of jobs at home from the Great Depression. And during this time of war, the idea of independence from the British Empire began to permeate through Belize, which came back with the individuals that had gone off to take part in war efforts. During this post-war period, we see several parties arise, fighting for either independence or colonial reforms for equality. As this was during a period of general decolonization, slowly the British relinquished control and gave in to the demands of the populace. One of the many parties that sprang up, the People's United Party, formerly the People's Committee, had grown massively in popularity, as the governor of then British Honduras decided to devalue the Belizean currency against the vocal opposition of the masses and the PUP. This, as well as a very well-fought popularity campaign, won the PUP the colony's first general election with universal suffrage. Voting for the People's United Party was considered a vote for decolonization. They would go on to win several more elections following. The PUP built a new capital, Belmopan, in the wake of another hurricane hitting the former capital, Belize City. This new city would be built further inland and on higher terrain to protect from flooding. As the nation moved towards independence, it lived in constant fear of an impending Guatemalan invasion, as Guatemala still claimed the lands of Belize. This was a major factor as to why the nation had not pushed for independence harder. The English soon sent an aircraft carrier and thousands of troops to Belize, as there was intelligence that discovered an invasion may occur, and now a Guatemalan army appeared on the Belizean border. The British army scared the Guatemalans enough to calm the situation, but this showed to Belize that the nation would never be independent without international support. This led to the nation's government appealing to the UN, Commonwealth of Nations, and the non-aligned movement to support in their independence. This diplomacy came to the point that Guatemala no longer had supporters of their claim, and the Belizeans felt safe enough to officially declare independence. Britain maintained a military presence in the region to deter Guatemala, and trained Belizean troops. This foreign army would eventually leave, but the British would continue training local troops. There was a renewed fervor in Guatemalan claims, where both militaries had patrols on their borders, and one Guatemalan soldier was even killed. But these actions never escalated further than this. The PUP government, led by Said Musa, now decided to raise taxes to try and curb the national debt, but it sparked national protests, with many claiming corruption in the government. These individuals would eventually be dispersed by police, but not without riots, and in the next election, Said Musa would be booted from office in favor of the opposition, headed by Dean Barrow. Belize became a large transit hub for the transfer of illegal drugs to North America, and due to this, Belize has been added to a blacklist of the USA, meaning American sanctions were placed on the nation. Finally, Belize and Guatemala agreed to send their territorial dispute to the International Court of Justice to finally determine who the lands belonged to. The investigation, though, was halted, as the spread of COVID-19 has made working conditions unsafe. The disease caused the nation to enter a lockdown state, but as their cases remained few and controlled, Belize felt safe enough to reopen the nation. This began a massive spike in cases that before had remained below 100, but now only continues to rise. And that is the state of the nation of Belize.